welcome to my newest video. I have a very special guest today, and it's Liz Wilson. And Liz here is an expert in marine engineering offshore services, and she works within the maritime industry for a very long time. She's a managing director of her own consultancy in marine engineering services, and she is here today with us to talk about career transition and how she got here in this position as her own managing director in the first place. And it's very excited to have you here, Liz, and a warm welcome as one of the power women in the industry.
No, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no, it's good to, the idea for today is to give a little motivation, a little boost to all the people out there in the maritime industry who are going through a major career transition right now and feel like they're not sure to make the right move. And by talking about a little bit about your experiences, we hope to motivate others as well in the industry. So maybe you want to start with telling a little bit about yourself and your background.
Oh gosh, that's going back. How long have you got? So I chose engineering from leaving school and did an environmental engineering degree at Strathclyde University. And I was very lucky at that time where environmental engineering was quite new, a new area that the industry was developing and getting into. And I was fortunate to be spotted by Lloyd's Register, the Classification Society. And I was sponsored through university, and on graduating, I started to work for them on their graduate training scheme. So I was with them for many years, had tremendous experience, worked both in the UK and abroad as a field surveyor, as a ship surveyor. But all good things come to an end. I'd already undertaken part-time a master's in maritime offshore engineering technology, which included offshore decommissioning of offshore platforms. So I decided to step aside and set up my own limited company so I could explore maybe areas that perhaps were not going to be in my particular job description when I was with Lloyd's. And it gave me the scope to get involved with other projects, work with other people who I'd met in my network over the years, but also develop my interest in decommissioning, because to me that harmonized my engineering background, my sort of ship operations, maritime operations, but also with my environmental roots, because it's obviously a very big driver in what happens with offshore platforms when they're decommissioned. So I balanced all those things, and I wouldn't say I'm a master of any trade. I'm very much like to look sort of laterally at where there's skill transfer and best practice can be learned from maybe one industry and apply to another. And so that's kind of generally how I look at what the work and the projects that I do.
Yeah, and you're a PhD researcher as well, and in offshore engineering.
Yeah, still trying to finish that. So yeah, that's a lockdown project that I finally put the seal on that.
So the main topic for today is transformation, and I know you went through quite a big transformation yourself, and the big question is why you decided to move on, and can you tell a little bit what happened and what triggered you to go from working for a business and setting up your own business? And
yeah, sure. So as I said, I joined Lloyd's on graduating and went through their graduate training scheme as a engineering surveyor, which was a tremendous opportunity. And when at that time in particular, I think you joined Lloyd's with a view to that was your career. It was a job for life. There was it was maybe not the best paid, you know, and certainly my peers went into management consultancy and got higher salaries than I did, but the experience and what I gained was definitely one of the best in the industry. But changes within that business, and subsequently to the terms of my role. So I'd previously been posted abroad in South Korea, in the Netherlands, in Spain. Those opportunities were not quite the same, and the terms were not the same. So they were looking at, basically, it was cheaper to employ nationals in these countries than it was to put an expat in that place. So that made me start to think that perhaps my career path would not be as I thought it was. And then events in my personal life also caused me to think about how I was treated. As you can imagine, I was a female in a very male-dominated environment, and I probably put up with being treated in certain ways. I was far more tolerant than I should have been, and it became fairly obvious that I was being discriminated against. I was paid lower than my male counterparts for the same role, and I was in the same office as my team manager. So everything I did was under far more scrutiny than anybody else in my team who were in other locations. And then when I raised these issues with human resources, it took ages to respond, as though they had to really dig into what was going on to try and find an excuse or a reason as to why I was being treated differently from others. And almost made to feel as though it was in my head. The team as a whole became quite dysfunctional. I certainly wasn't the only one having a problem. Everybody had their own fight, but also their own constraints. What happens, I don't think you can ever say that you keep your business life separate from your personal life, because the one will always affect the other. And so people who maybe have very high mortgages or families to support, or caring roles, can't maybe walk away from a role the same way as someone who's single with no children and is maybe more flexible in approach. So I started to keep a record of all the incidences where I felt that I was undermined, harassed, bullied, and they were essentially by another member of my team and by my manager. I think I had about 30 pages of independent events when I raised a formal grievance.
That's quite
yeah, and that process, which in a previous role I'd actually written, it should have been a 10-day investigative process, and it took them 10 weeks, which was an incredibly stressful period. 3 months of stress counselling, but I had to see that out. I did have some support in the challenge by other people within the organisation, but if I didn't ride it out, nothing would change. One of my biggest faults is probably that where I sit on social injustice. I might not always fight to better the situation for myself, but I know that there's many others who go affected who maybe haven't got the voice, who can't fight, and I like to sort of flag up that kind of toxic behavior. And bullies, fundamentally, they shouldn't get away with it.
It's true. You're brave enough to raise your voice against this women and female discrimination in a male-dominated industry. And I know from my own experience that when you're stepping into that industry, you are aware that it will be tougher, and you need to be stronger, and you need to be performing above all the rest to be able to accept it in some point. But this is harassment and bullying, and being underpaid compared to your male colleague is quite horrible, and not being that by your superiors, that it's not being acknowledged as such, is quite shocking and quite stressful. I can understand that.
I think if I was going to be devil's advocate and give the benefit of the doubt, I don't think that there was necessarily a deliberate intent to have pay me differently because I was a female. It was more to do with it just wasn't properly thought out. and they weren't very good at explaining why there should be any discrepancy at all. It was very thin. And I think that was the attitude. A lot of the processes, they weren't used to having sort of female in very technical roles. And I think a lot of the processes, as often happens, they're developed on a unisex basis, which is fine. But then if you're trying to bring people through in different, or if you've got more experience, or you pay somebody who's new to the company more, clearly from a business bit as an incentive, but if that then person is doing the same role as you and they haven't got the experience and knowledge that you have, that's not just discrimination, it's insulting as well, because it makes you feel that you're not valued and you're homegrown. And that was a big thing, not just with me, but the whole team. Most of us had been with the company for over 10 years at this point, and had come in and all gone through a training scheme that was revered in the industry. If that's on my CV, I could walk into any other classification society and many other companies without much of ado, because it was known that that training was second to none. But yet the company itself didn't seem to value what it had. And in other departments, we lost a tremendous amount of people into the oil and gas industry, because they would go from verification and not be recognized or valued from where they were, yet the oil and gas, their clients were going, but you're brilliant, come to us. And it was messed up. And I think they shot themselves in the foot in a big way for doing that.
Such a shame, that's like, I get that you're there. It wasn't intentional, it's just a culture there is, and there's not enough awareness maybe for what the devastating effect it can have on female in the workplace. And what made you come to this industry in the first place? What were your visions?
My father was a chief engineer, marine engineer. So I've always been exposed to engineering. I was interested in, the whole maths, physics, engineering when at school. And as much as I desperately didn't want to follow in my father's footsteps, that appears to be what's happened. While I was at university, I did a summer job with Lloyd's. I lie. Before I went to university, I got a job in an engineering firm in Aberdeen, which is where I lived. And I was working in the planning department and putting together weld-out qualifications, because at that time, this is really showing my age now, at that time, things were moving to be digitized just in normal Word document, even, because it was going from where diagrams had been hand drawn and they would now be put into digital documents. And I was dealing with certificates, and they were stamped. They were stamped by two companies, Lloyd's or DNV, Det Norske Veritas, the Norwegian equivalent. And so I asked the question, I said, who are these people? What do they do? And it was just explained to me, and it just sounded really interesting. And they did a presentation at Strathclyde while I was there as an undergraduate. And I went along just to see what they were going to say, actually. And as a result of it, I got 2 years sponsorship at university and a job at the end of my degree, which was amazing. But the diversity of the company, and a classification society is an amazing place to work, because it has so many departments, so many faculties, and also working abroad. You work worldwide, all sorts of different ship types, marine structures. It was a tremendous opportunity. I was really, really lucky, and I loved it, from that side of it. But I think at the time, I was right on that cusp of when it became moved from where people stayed in the same job for 30 years and then retired from that company, to then going the other way, to then having lots of different things on your CV was not a bad thing. It showed that you had more diversity and experience. It was just that cusp of changing things. And equally, there were plenty of jobs within the company that I couldn't do. There was countries that I'd love to work in, Arabian shipyards in the Middle East. What a fantastic experience. But single white female, not a chance.
Yeah, it's true.
Not at my time. I know since then there have been female surveyors who've gone out there, which is brilliant, but it wasn't not to be on my watch. So
been a beginning of a changed world. It's quite interesting that you mentioned that as well, and as with your passion for working for the industry and your dreams and goals within there, and that you say it's fantastic to work for, and you were very lucky to come within that classification society, and with all the travels and all the experience. So for working there for so long and then decide to really make that transition and to quit and to start a new career, a new journey, that must have been quite a tough decision, knowing from where you come from. And that was you saying as well, that was their loss as well. And so what was the trigger point for you that you knew, well, okay, this is it, I have enough? Because it's quite a big decision.
I think it was partly, I mean, I raised a grievance. I think when you do these things in your head, you've already made a decision of what how you want that outcome, and whether or not you're going to stay or leave. And I think I'd already made the decision that I was going to leave before I raised that grievance. But I wanted to leave with my head held high, you know, not have any of that sort of blame claim kind of against me, that I had done nothing wrong. And I was the grievance was upheld in my favor. So, but I was initially sort of, certain people were like, well, you know, just move to another department.
Yeah.
No, then I would be branded as a troublemaker, and sort of,
that's a sad
I didn't feel
thing.
comfortable with that. And I felt I had more to offer, because I was also, you know, you get in a job and there's bounds around that job of what you can and can't do. And I had obviously got a lot of skills that I was now beginning to not be able to maintain, because they weren't relevant to my current role, but may have been in the future. And there was this view that, well, you'll just have to tread water until you go back and then build up again in a technical role before you can move on. I felt I was going in circles, and it was like, if I've worked for myself, I wouldn't need to do that, because I could apply all my skills to whatever projects, you know, and build them up and use them in areas that perhaps they hadn't been used before. So I felt as I was being railroaded, away from technical, which is my foundation. I'm not really a management person. I never wanted to manage other people. I think what you just said is like, you're passionate about doing your job because you enjoy it and you get something out of that. Trying to motivate people who do not share that motivation and enthusiasm is tremendously difficult.
Yes, and very draining as well.
Yeah, and certainly at that time in my career, I wasn't interested, you know, quite happily working with people. I'm not against working with others or coaching or mentoring. I do plenty of that, but not with somebody who thinks that it's a problem that they have to turn up and actually do some output every day. I haven't got the patience for that.
Well, it's what you said as well. If you work for another department and you will be transferred, that you will be seen as a troublemaker, and that's quite a significant comment to place, because that's how a lot of females feel. Or anybody who stands up against a toxic workplace and to stand up against bullying. But like, if you raise your voice and you stand up to it, you'll be seen as a troublemaker.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't take the decision to cause a fuss, let's say, lightly. And I will confess that I structured my grievance very, very particularly against a particular individual and not another female, because the claims against another female who clearly was bullying and me, and trying to rope other people into bullying me. And I'll put things in about, you know, my image, what clothes I wore to work, how my hair was. You know, this is nothing about a professional technical capability. No. This was pure, quite bitchy vindictiveness to try and keep you down. but because it was some of the comments were against another woman, they were immediately dismissed.
Wow.
They weren't, it wasn't until I could highlight that my male manager was a problem, and he had his own issues that were not being addressed. But I had to make it clean. There was plenty more I could have said, but anything that was against the other female was dismissed as if, which we all know is wrong, but as if another woman can't bully another woman, which is rubbish. But that's kind of how it was seen. It was like, oh well, it's just a jealousy thing, maybe she thinks she's prettier than you or something. It's like, I don't care. I'm not. Yeah, I'm not in this environment. Sorry.
Why do you think she made comments? Why did she bully you?
I think in both cases, part of the problem, the roles that I'd had made me quite high profile. I was very well known in the company, and I had also worked at board level. I'm fairly conscientious. I work hard to be as good as I can be. And I think I was a threat. I don't mean that to sound at all arrogant, but
no.
My next step was I was looking at team manager level. And I wasn't, but the people that I was looking to replace hadn't got the same options as me, because they hadn't got the same skills, they hadn't got the same experience. So when people are sort of backed into a corner like that, they will do everything. They don't look at it for themselves and go, well, how do I make myself better so I stand more of a chance against this person? Mm-hmm. They instead focus on putting you down, mm-hmm. and pushing you away and defending their corner. But that's the difference. When you have companies that say about redundancies, there are always groups of people who go, oh, I'm not going to hang around for that. I've got stuff I can offer. I'll go. And there's a well-known expression in business about having the dead wood that's left. And it's those people who may have skills to offer. It's not that they haven't got anything to offer, but they don't see it in themselves, or they can't promote themselves. And so they're going to get left behind. So I don't know. And I think, on many occasions, you fight. You will probably be the same. You said it earlier about how we work so hard to prove that we know what we're doing and we're good at what we're doing, just to make ourselves seem as equal to, think the current, especially the mediocre white man that we're working with. And I was about 23, and I had that moment where I had the aged ex-captain from the Statutory Flag Administration doing an inspection with me, and he messed it up completely. And I was just like, I'm done. I don't need to fight anymore, because I know what I'm doing, and I haven't got anything to compete against here.
So it's quite significant. So besides being discriminated as a female, it's also discriminated being successful and knowledgeable, and discriminated against your age. And it's quite something to deal with, especially when you're 23.
Yeah, and I think that you experience this yourself in when you were at sea as well. There was always the view that you had to have spent time at sea, and your male colleagues might have only spent about 5 years at sea, and you've spent 10 years in the job as operations, yet their sea time experience somehow counts more than what you've done. And it's nice, I suppose, at first to get your teeth into something and learn and become good at it, but it gets a bit weary when you feel as though you're overlooked, mm-hmm. through no fault of your own, just because the perception is that you can't possibly know what you're doing because you're a woman. I'd like to say that we don't have that anymore, but in the current climate and all the things that have been in the news lately, I'm really disappointed to see that 20 odd years later, we're still going through the same questions.
There's a lot of women who will listen to this interview and will recognize themselves in you, and who might not ever have been to sea either. And I've not spent so much time on a ship either, so but I've spent a lot of time in the industry, so I still feel like an imposter myself, like, oh, you know, it's just I'm not that much experience at sea at all. But your story really will resonate with myself and with a lot of other women, power women in the industry, who are leading on the marine engineering field. And knowing what you know now and looking back, that you stood up for your values and your boundaries, and prevent yourself from going really under. And a lot of other people might not be so lucky, as they might have, you know, family, and they have a mortgage to, they have all sorts of commitments, and they cannot make that transition that bravely. And what would you, looking back now, what would you recommend your younger self?
Believe in yourself. Care less what others think. I think that's a very normal thing for young people of a generation, that they look for approval, and they want to be praised and told that they're on the right track. You know, as we said, it was male dominated, which never bothered me. You know, I don't bother about working with all men, and I think I don't necessarily like all women environments. I think they're just
a whole different interview.
Yeah, and I think that when you have mixed groups like that, you can learn a lot, both in terms of knowledge, but also how to handle situations, because, you know, physiologically we are different and we will respond differently. But I accepted then that I just needed to prove that I was better, and we've just, you know, it's just such a wrong attitude to have. But the foundation was sound. You know, I wouldn't say, conversely, you know, don't go into this going, well, I need some kind of special dispensation because I'm female. No. That's bull. You know, you work hard, you do your best, you don't expect a free ride, but you just expect it to be, you know, acknowledged for what you put out. And it might be a different slant. You know, there's a whole different conversation we could have about unconscious bias on this.
Yes. Oh yes. Yes.
But, you know, I think my lack of self-confidence at the time made me far more susceptible to being manipulated, and not able to stand up for myself. So when I've been in similar situations as an older person, more experienced, I've probably not taken as much. I've nipped it, because you know, you start to learn the signs, and you just kind of nip it in the bud straight away.
Yeah, that's, wow, that resonates truly with me as well. I can hear your words, and I would advise my younger self the same thing. And that you're saying, you're believe in yourself, and that you maybe as a younger person were not, your self-esteem was not up to it, or not high enough to really nip it in the bud, as you say, and stand up for yourself at that point. That's quite important, and believe that what you're doing is right, no matter if you're 23, whatever age, you're younger, you have that level of experience. And be proud and raise your voice, and together we can stay strong. And it's a shame that it still happens in the workforce anywhere, and not necessarily for females as either. It could be, you know, discrimination can happen at all levels, for all cultures and all areas. And being now, for running your own business and being a marine engineering consultant, it's quite good to have that stand now, that you can just be a role model for other younger marine females in the industry, and telling them to believe in themselves, and to really stand up against bullying. So if you're looking forward now, what would you like to achieve for your future, for any woman's future in the marine industry? What would you like to see?
I think it's the equity side. You know, I think we will approach situations differently, and that's just pure biology, physiology. I think women tend to have more emotional intelligence, we are just more intuitive by nature. And I think that's part of the problem, that often we're judged. And I think it doesn't matter what gender you are, people judge others because on how they would handle a situation and how that other person compares, rather than maybe looking at the outcome. You know, they look too much about how it was achieved. And that's where it falls down, because we get in that unconscious bias side, that just because you highlight maybe softer issues, the outcome is still maybe the right one. And I think it's just an age and experience thing, that as you get older, again, we care less. I definitely care less about what other people think, because I know that my justifications for acting a particular way, I can justify and I can challenge. You know, if I'll call somebody else out about it. But when you're younger, new to an industry, both male and female find it difficult to do. And maybe, you know, if I hadn't had the experiences that I had, would I be the way I am now? You know, would I have maybe not learned how to deal with them early on, and therefore be more flawed and find that much more difficult to handle them if they were happening to me now?
That's true.
You know,
quite interesting to think about is that raises the question as well. What do you think would have happened if you would have stayed?
Oof. I don't think that was an option. You know, I nearly didn't actually see out the grievance. I was persuaded to, because it had to happen. You know, I won my case. You know, there was no way that I couldn't. You know, keep notes, contemporaneous notes and evidence. They're crucial. But the bad feeling that had been created by the behaviours and the reality of how the company sort of sacrificed some to cover for others couldn't be ignored. Didn't surprise me later to find out that the whole team was sort of dismantled and redeveloped and reformed. And I think many of the people that I worked with back in those days, not just in my team, but across the company who I knew, have moved on to other pastures. So yeah, I do have another colleague who, a male colleague who went through something similar, who felt he was bullied, raised a grievance, and he moved to another department. He was in a very specialized role. He moved into another department, and I think he lost a lot of respect in some ways for that, because he then stayed at the company. He's since been made redundant, and I think he has struggled to find work in other areas and ended up doing something quite different. But he just wasn't of the character. You know, I know that I can be a bit feisty. You know, as people get to know me, they know not to rattle my cage. I don't go looking for an argument, but I'm also not going to be put down or criticized when there's no just cause. And I think there was no way I could have stayed, because there was no way I could have moved to another department and be treated like that. I always felt sad that my colleague had done that, and the way he was sort of thought of after that. And I guess that was a warning sign to me.
That's quite sad, isn't it, that you decide to make the best of it and decide to move to another department, and then you somehow you are seen as the troublemaker, and instead of the company just really tapping into emotional intelligence and trying to better the culture, or asking questions, what's wrong with the culture, that it's a person with so much knowledge and experience would feel this way, and you know, what's really happening and how can we move on? And I do think on a positive note that the industries of today are more aware of these situations and are trying to implement all kinds of schemes for coaching mental health, raising emotional intelligence, raising teamwork, focusing on values and team values, and how can you perform better as a team, and not just for the profit, but for the human being, as a human-centered approach. And I do think there's more awareness. So that's good. That's a step forward.
I think there's awareness, but I think that most people like a quiet life. So nobody appreciates the sort of the status quo being rattled by someone who's not happy. But there's a really sort of, I don't know who said it, but there's a really apt expression that says that no one notices, everyone notices the reaction of a person, but no one notices their provocation.
That's true.
You'll be blamed for reacting because you've taken about as much as you can.
True.
But it's not necessarily a short-term flare-up. There's obviously many things that have gone on that have not been right, and that's the bit that people find uncomfortable to deal with, that actually they could have done something or acted a long time ago but didn't, and then you're the person who's wrong for reacting. I don't get that.
I think it's human nature not to rattle the cage if it goes smoothly, especially as you're maybe managing the team. If there's no problem at the surface, you're just probably won't touch it, and nobody wants to deal with that. It's just the sad reality. I think it's in our genetics as well, I think, and it's a fair point, and it's how could we learn from this? How would you advise any managing leader that are listening and wanting to really raise up to the game? What would you advise them to do?
I think industry is actually moving into this, where when they're advertising roles, it's less about your sort of qualifications and things that are relevant. It's more about how you handle situations and your knowledge and understanding, or how you deal in difficult situations, and maybe with people how you collaborate with people who are not like you, whether that be in terms of ability, culture, language, multinational groups. So I think we're getting there. I think there is a general approach over industry to sort of look at differently and take people and measure them on their capabilities rather than what is perceived by a qualification. There's no point people having loads of qualifications if they can't actually deliver. Or we've talked about higher education. I think this is where a lot of PhD people come unstuck, because academically they're brilliant, but especially if they've gone through the whole education system and they haven't worked in teams before, their social skills and their ability to work as a team, because they're so used to working alone, means that they're not generally employable in many roles. And I know the universities try and widen that now by adding other skills and teaching people more for industry, but that's always been a problem with people who, the old school sort of sock and sandal wearing PhD.
Sock and sandal, I like that image.
They were so brilliant they couldn't relate to other people. I mean, I don't think that's not the case now, but I think there's a lot of stereotyping. Don't judge people, and don't judge people off your own biases.
That's quite an important thing. Don't judge people on your own biases. That the realization we're all biased, and we all, have our own paradigm going on, our own story and our own view of the world, and that you are to have a better collaboration with your team and with your peers and your managers to realize their point of view, their standpoint. It's quite good to discuss that in team meetings as well, I think, just to not just about the figures and the outcomes and your goals of the team, but also your own personal values, if they still check in, if they still match with the companies, and what your own vision is, and if that's matches with that of your teammates.
Yeah, I think there's sometimes, as a manager, there's an assumption that that person knows it all, that they've got all the answers, and therefore they should be able to come up with everything. And I don't think that's right. I don't think that's necessarily the case. They may have experience of dealing with those problems or situations in the past, but they're not necessarily the ones with the answer. The role in terms, this is where we get into the nuances between leadership and management. But don't be afraid to have people working for you. It's not a hierarchy, who are better at something than you. Utilize the whole point of the management side and leadership is using their skills for the better team output. Just because, you know, they are supposedly a lower, you know, rank or grade than you, or new to the company, doesn't mean that their experiences and knowledge are invalid or lesser than yours. And I think that sometimes, I don't know if it's an ego thing, that people think that they've got to a certain managerial position and therefore they've made it in the bee's knees and no one else can challenge them. But you should be always learning, you know, always developing yourself. You don't suddenly stop, but many do. Many, you know, your team is exactly that. It's a team. It means working together and bringing out the best in those people. Don't be afraid to push people so they go beyond you. They've got an area or a skill or an opportunity that you couldn't meet, then don't hold them back.
That's fantastic. I like that as a perfect ending quote of our talk. Like, you know, for the message for all managers out there: don't be afraid to learn, and don't be afraid to have somebody in your team that is more knowledgeable in some areas than you are. You're all a team. You need each other to make the perfect outcome, and you need to utilize that. You need to have the best to motivate people to do the best they can, and not just because from a top down screaming like I'm the best, I'm the manager. That's quite old fashioned, and it might be a cultural thing sometimes as well. And I think this is the perfect ending quote as well. So I love to have you here and your view on things, and I hope we can inspire some other female out there, male, female, anybody who feels like they're on the edge of a career transition or scared to make the move, and who we will just tell them to, you know, believe in who you are and be confident, stand up for your values, and you'll set your boundaries no matter what age and what experience level, how many diplomas you have. Just be you, basically. Do you want to have any last saying? Do you want to have anything before we
no, I think you've summed it up really, really well. I think, you know, let's not be dragged back into trying to relearn all the lessons that, you know, I wasn't one of the first females coming in through technology. You know, I was on the crest of the women in the 80s who did it before me. Let's not forget about what they did and the achievements. Let's not try and reinvent the wheel. Let's maybe change the shape of it.
Yes, let's change the shape. And no, thank you very much, and for your experience and talk to us here today. And I'd love to talk to you again about the biases. And we see you around on the social media platforms. And thank you very much, and have a lovely day.
My pleasure. Thanks, Tineke.